So, 4.5, eh? Hopefully those of you who disagreed with Kevin's review of Resident Evil 6 have since gone and played it for yourself. But for those of you who are asking for a second opinion from GameSpot, I tried to play some earlier today, but I didn't get very far.
Johnny, I don't want to play anymore.
You have to finish the game, Danny.
But it's awful.
Alright, let's be honest, this has been a long time coming. Some of our favourite games of all time have Resident Evil printed on the box, but Capcom have also milked this series for over a decade. So-called fans have been up in arms over the reception to this new Resident Evil, but any true fan would call a spade a spade. And if Resident Evil 6 is a spade, it's one of those spades that a park cleaner uses to spade up dog shit. The things that made this series great have been lost in recent incarnations, so maybe it's time we reminded ourselves of what made Resi great, and how recent games have pandered to blockbuster ideologies in an effort to increase sales. Resident Evil is called Resident Evil because of these guys. American metalheads Biohazard already held claim to the Japanese title, forcing Capcom to call it something else outside of Asia. Presumably on short notice, taking the mansion setting and the foreboding atmosphere, they came up with Resident Evil. Perhaps we should be thankful they didn't call it Zombie Landlord or Corpse Mortgage.
Joseph!
The first Resident Evil, released on the PlayStation in 1996, was a great game. It was scary as hell, had a unique cinematic camera, 2 playable characters, an intuitive control system, and was hard as balls. In the mid-90s, we were used to gunning down waves of baddies without a thought, but Resident Evil made each enemy encounter significant. Zombies weren't overly strong, but ammunition was scarce. You could use your knife, but the zombies were dangerous at short range, and health was just as hard to come by. On top of that, save games could only be made in specific rooms with typewriters, and only if you found one of these single-use ink ribbons spotted around the mansion.
And that's how Resident Evil got under your skin. Sure, the restrictive camera angles and eerie music helped, but it was that constant sense of vulnerability that created real fear.
There's a moment in most action games where you stop worrying about engaging in battle, you're comfortable with your armor and weaponry, and save for some obvious boss battles, combat isn't as tough as it was in the beginning, while frequent saves mean you're never really too worried about death. This is why modern shooters are completely absent of authenticity or fear. Sure, bullet damage and enemy health can be tweaked to make it more difficult, but you're never in fear of your character's life. In Resident Evil, the last save game could be an hour ago, ammo was scarce, and just when you got the hang of killing zombies, they introduced friggin' mutant things that could decapitate you from across the room. Released 2 years later, Resident Evil 2 took the natural step of trying to be bigger than its predecessor. The large, widely explorable Raccoon City felt absolutely huge after the confined environment of the mansion. Like the first game, it had 2 playable characters, but it added a zapping system which provided each character with unique storylines and obstacles. After completing Story A with one protagonist, Story B would be unlocked, and the actions you took during the first playthrough, such as the availability of certain items, would impact on the second. New enemies such as the liquor, varied puzzles, and a broader range of weapons added to a game that mechanically was very similar to the first one. And just like Resi 1, Resident Evil 2 was a huge hit, and is still considered to be one of the best games of the PlayStation 1 era. With 2 huge successes behind him, Capcom bravely tinkered with the formula for 1999's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The aforementioned Nemesis was a massive bloke with a rocket launcher who hunted down members of... At various points in the game, you would encounter him in a standoff, often based on your actions or path of progression, often giving you the option of fleeing or fighting. The game was set in Raccoon City both before and after the events of Resident Evil 2, and just as well really, because the raccoons didn't come out of it too well.
So you may have noticed I haven't talked much about the story, and that's because, as far as I'm concerned, the story in Resident Evil is melodramatic bollocks. Each new game added new layers of bollocks on top of the previous bollocks, and it just gets more and more complicated and convoluted, and ultimately a lot less compelling.
But who cares? It's like the story bits in porn. It ties together the action nicely. And sure, there are some individual cinematic moments that are impressive, but it's all quite embarrassing and the voice acting is awful.
I need a $500 retainer fee.
But just take a look at this.
But I don't have $500.
Thanks for saving my life.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
$27?
Yep.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
Before she was running for president, she was a Colombian drug lord prostitute.
How about going down to check by yourself? I have a rope here.
Oh, do you? Well, then I'll try to go down using the rope.
So it's a good thing that for the most part, the narrative beats in Resi don't overstay their welcome. We get a simple setup followed by lots of hardcore action and some great camera angles. There's a sexy policewoman and a bit where somebody does a lot of licking. Half the people involved are riddled with some sort of virus, and it all culminates in an epic finish where a huge muscled man explodes all over the screen.
If you feel aggrieved by this and want to learn more about Resident Evil's rich fiction, then I know the perfect place where you can read all about it. It's called
the Internet. The fourth Resident Evil game was the first not to premiere on a Sony console. Code Veronica debuted on the Dreamcast and played very similar to Nemesis, but it added a few details like dual-wielding pistols and continues. It looked fantastic too. I still remember that gorgeous trailer they released that blew everyone's minds. Veronica was a worthy addition to the series, but it was around this time that Resi started to step into crazy spin-off prequel tie-in mode. In fact, apart from 2008, at least one Resident Evil game has been released every year since the first title in 1996. 2001 saw Resident Evil Gaiden, a pretty rudimentary top-down affair for the Game Boy Color. 03 had Resident Evil Outbreak, a competent if underwhelming online-enabled game for the PlayStation 2. A year later, it received a standalone expansion, File 2. 2002 saw the genuinely breathtaking GameCube remake of the first Resident Evil, and later that year, we had a fantastic exclusive new game for the console, Resident Evil Zero. Zero was a prequel where you were in charge of the Bravo team that got all effed up in the first game. You played as two characters throughout the game, everybody's favourite Moonlight Sonata player Rebecca Chambers and this tattooed guy. What's his name? Billy Cohen. Billy Cohen? Yeah, whatever.
But a significant amount of Resident Evil spin-offs have been first-person rail shooters.
The G-Con-enabled Resident Evil Survivor hit shelves in 2000 and was the first of 4 games in the Gun Survivor series. Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica released in 2002, 2003's Resident Evil Dead Aim, while Japan also got Dino Stalker, a Dino Crisis spin-off. Actually, now that I think about it, hey Capcom, make more Dino Crisis games! The Wii got 2 Resi rail shooters of its very own, 2007's Umbrella Chronicles and 2009's Darkside Chronicles. They were alright, you know, if you're into rail shooters on the Wii. There's been a few DS games too, the not-so-good Deadly Silence released in 06, The Mercenaries released in 2011 for the 3DS, and 2012's Resident Evil Revelations.
So already we have a split between the classic Resident Evil games and the others that aren't awful or anything, but are certainly a lot less memorable. And if you're looking for a reason why the split occurs, then the answer is probably Shinji Mikami.
The story of Resident Evil, and indeed much of Capcom's success, involved Shinji Mikami. He directed the first game, produced the difficult sequel, redesigning it at one point, and oversaw development of Nemesis while simultaneously directing Dino Crisis. He produced Code Veronica and executive produced the excellent Devil May Cry, a game which was originally planned as a Resi spin-off.
That's the game now, not that weird Ghanaian movie.
Some vessel Devil May Cry!
Devil may cry. Devil may cry.
He became GM of Capcom Production Studio 4 and aided the ailing GameCube by having them develop the Capcom 5, a series of exclusive titles, while also signing an exclusivity deal that would see the core Resident Evil games only appear on Nintendo's troubled console. This paid off for the high-selling remake of Resident Evil 1, but Resident Evil 0 didn't fare too well at retail, prompting fears that Resident Evil was a franchise stuck in the past.
Joseph!
Resi 3.5 was conceived as the final chapter in the series. Hiroshi Shibata of Castlevania fame, a designer who would later go on to lead on Okami and Bayonetta, was armed with the task of creating its swan song. But Mikami wasn't ready to bury the series quite yet. He took over directing duties from Shibata, made fundamental changes to the way it played, and released it under a new title, Resident Evil 4. Resi 4 was a triumphant return to form, a break from the gameplay and thematic baggage of the previous games, coupled with established action game mechanics, created a game that was progressive but retained the tension and vulnerability of the original games. It was disturbing, foreboding, and had an emphasis on the environment and ammunition management. Just like the original games, running away was often the best tactic. It sold 1.25 million units within a year, but despite Mikami saying he'd cut his own head off if Resi had ever seen on a platform other than the GameCube, it was eventually released on the PlayStation 2. But Mikami was true to his word, featuring a dog called Mikami's Head in his underrated action beat-em-up God Hand. 2009 saw the release of the next chapter in the core series, but though it was well reviewed and sold millions, it signalled a troubling new direction for the series. While 4 was undeniably different to the previous games in terms of mechanics, it felt like an old school Resi game. Sparse ammunition and a variety of difficult foes forced you to think strategically about your actions. But while Resident Evil 5 had the same over-the-shoulder camera and the enemies were similar, it was now an action game. It was a run-and-gun action game. It looked great and the cutscenes were really entertaining, but it wasn't really scary anymore. It was sunny, and you had loads of ammo. You were killing waves of these guys like it wasn't really a thing. I remember enjoying playing it, but it didn't really feel like Resi anymore. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Games are ever evolving, but in an industry saturated with action games, it seemed odd that a sequel to such a breakthrough in design would be so generic. As it happens, this was part of a wider Capcom strategy that would see them try to engage Western audiences more. This year's third-person shooter, Operation Raccoon City, should have been a warning sign, but despite being, let's be honest, crap, it sold over 2 million units. And then last week, Resident Evil 6 came out and confirmed our biggest fears, that in trying to sell more to Western audiences, Capcom have killed what made Resident Evil great. Clever game design that made you feel like even small actions were important, feeling vulnerable, and using your wits to outsmart enemies in intense scenarios. These fundamentally rewarding gameplay mechanics have been replaced by press X to see bugs and explosions. We gave it an honest negative assessment, leading to passionate outcries from fans of the series. We understand the passion. It's hard to think that Resident Evil has actually come to this, but it has, and placating and supporting bad games isn't going to solve anything. Capcom needed commercial failure to see the error of their ways. Whether or not they got away with it, we still don't know. But gone are the days of unanimously good Resident Evil games. Today you have to ask yourself, what are you buying?
So what would you like to see happen to Resident Evil? Would you like a sequel to 6? Would you like to see it canned completely? Or are we talking about full reboot mode here? Let us know as ever in the comment box below, or feel free to Twitter me directly. Next week is the penultimate episode of this season of Escape from Mount Stupid, so we're going to focus on an entire genre, my favourite genre in fact, but one that's had me bored to tears in recent years, and I'm not the first person to say it. There's a clue there. It's about first-person shooters!